Hello, this is ICAST News, direct from UN headquarters in New York, on a bright and hot sunny day, and I am Ian Williams here with the climate changes to talk about the big subject, climate change, which has been preoccupying the UN for decades now. And when I first came across it as a correspondent 20 years ago, people couldn't tell the difference between the ozone layer disappearing, climate change coming on, global warming, and of course the whole thing was obfuscated by the peculiar economic theology that said that if it was bad for business it couldn't be happening. And that's what we're seeing now. It is happening. 10 years ago, I was on Fox once and somebody said, well, what do you think about all of these hurricanes hitting the south? I said, well, these people believe they get messages from God. I think sort of 3 hurricanes in a month is a pretty strong message. You're wrong about climate change. And if you keep electing governors who don't believe in it, then what you're going to get is wet feet, flooded cities, and devastation. Now we've got going all over the world signs that I think 5 years ago we'd have been fairly panic-stricken. But it's not quite like the end times. But in New Delhi this week, temperatures reached 120 plus. People are dying because of heat in a city where they should be used to a little bit of heat at least. The rivers are drying up. Fresh water's disappearing across the world. The El Nino is causing droughts in other parts of the world. The Greenland glaciers are disappearing. Each week brings news reports of yet another glacier, yet another set of ice flows carving off Antarctica or the Arctic. Before long, Greenland is only actually going to put truth in the rumours of its name. It's going to go back to the warmest it was in the Viking times when people grew wheat there. It's a long way towards the end times. Now, why do people say climate change? Because they didn't want to say global warming. And there's a good reason and a bad reason. One is that climate change is fairly innocuous and could mean anything. So all across the world, whenever there's a cold snap, people say, call this global warming. And of course, we're talking about average temperatures. That's what makes the difference. And the fact that you actually get a frost in midwinter is not surprising, even under conditions of global warming. It's even possible, as scientists have pointed out, that global warming could lead to a new ice age, which is a bit contradictory. But when you think that our whole climate is dependent on the currents up the Atlantic, which are dependent upon ice coming off Greenland and sinking fresh water on top of the salt, pulling in water from the tropical oceans, that's the basis for the Gulf Stream. If it weren't for that current, Britain and Northern Europe would have the same climate as Greenland and Labrador. It doesn't because of the Gulf Stream. That is looking as though it could be switched off any moment. We're talking fairly catastrophic effects. And I think what disturbs me most is these things are happening so quickly. You have to remember, geological time is very slow. It's 5,000-6,000 years ago there were still mammoths and mastodons in North America and Europe. They went, but it took a long time. They didn't just disappear overnight. The glaciers didn't just melt overnight. It took whole seasons and people mightn't have even noticed it happening. But now things are happening so rapidly, we are beginning to notice it. There are birds and plants that are growing further north than ever before. There are invasive species. There are mosquitoes carrying the Zika virus, actually now in the mainland of the United States. So climate change is not just a theoretical construct. It's not just a fairy tale to frighten children or even oil shareholders. It is a real thing. And it must be serious because even the Gulf states who have been the holdouts, because, of course, if oil is responsible for carbon dioxide and carbon dioxide is responsible for climate change, then it can't be, because that means that you wouldn't be able to sell your oil. But even they are now preparing for the change. These signs, they're cumulative, they're building up more rapidly than ever before. And yet, by our science, what's a few years? People cannot really bring themselves to plan for future contingencies. But what worries me about the climate change that we're seeing now is that it's not just going to affect our children, which does concern me since I've got several, but it's going to be in our lifetimes. There's going to be fairly catastrophic changes. Those who saw Sandy last week, last year when the storm Sandy hit New York, we saw climate change in operation. We saw water lapping 10 foot up the side of buildings in Manhattan. It's going to be like Venice soon. People are going to have to build barrages and dams to keep it away. We're repairing the subway under the East River because it got flooded last time. Is it going to get flooded again soon? Why go to all of that effort unless you take steps to mitigate it? But the real step has got to be reducing the use of carbon dioxide if it's not too late. And that's where it's almost impossible, because apart from the theological obsession that climate change isn't happening, there's a theological obsession that you can't charge for the use of carbon because it's a tax. Carbon taxes are wrong. So it's much better to let people pour carbon dioxide into the atmosphere and take the consequences. That's not the way it should be, and the United Nations is about the only forum where these things can be negotiated and litigated. And it's far, far too slow, because there are major powers like Australia. They fall into the grip of theological conservatives who do not believe in climate change, whatever the evidence, and fail to take the action. So I'm looking forward over the next few months to tracking these changes, to seeing what's being done about climate change. And we'll be back in a week or so. This has been Ian Williams with climate changes from ICAS News, UN headquarters. See you next week.